Welcome to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Coming up, we'll review the week's top stories about Illinois Statehouse Democrats advancing a measure to change the state's election laws and a status update on state budget negotiations. I'll then join the Center Square's Dan McCaleb to further discuss those stories and more. That's ahead with Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop.
Do you care about classroom curriculum, transparency policies, and how your taxpayer dollars are invested in education, but you find it hard to cut through the partisan noise? Chalkboard News is bringing you straight news reporting on public K-12 education. We're talking news without spin. Chalkboard News publishes fact-based stories that make sense to parents, teachers, and readers who have skin in the game. Get this news delivered to your inbox for free by signing up at chalkboardnews.com. Subscribe today at chalkboardnews.com.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Here's some of the top stories from the past week. In less than 24 hours, Illinois Statehouse Democrats passed a measure that changes election law, a move Republicans say is a slap in the face of voters in the middle of an election cycle. What started as a bill about child welfare, Senate Bill 2412, was amended in the House Wednesday to remove the process of parties putting candidates on the general election ballot despite not running in a primary. Senate Minority Leader John Curran said the measure gets rid of competition in the middle of an election.
It's also a slap in the face to voters that one of the ballot questions you've included is about election interference when that's exactly what this legislation does. Think about that for a minute. You're saying you're afraid of competition and you do anything to gain one more seat, one more advantage in November.
Senate President Don Harmon said the measure addresses a practice he said's been abused, and the bill impacts both parties.
We Democrats won't be able to slate candidates for the Senate in any districts where your members are running unopposed.
Governor J.B. Pritzker signaled support for the measure, which can now be sent to his desk. Meanwhile, the governor said there's enough Illinois taxpayer revenue for his proposed $52.7 billion budget. Republican negotiators question that with a month before the deadline. Katrina Peterson reports.
Pritzker said tax revenues are on track and that the big question is how the General Assembly prioritized spending. He says he proposed a balanced budget.
It really only has one tax adjustment, actually two tax adjustments, but one new or additional tax.
State Senator Donald DeWitt said based on expected expenditures the governor submitted in February combined with $1 billion in tax increases that he proposed, technically it's a balanced budget on paper, but DeWitt said to call it a balanced budget, there are two things to consider.
A, that depends on whether the legislature gives him all of the spending he asked for, and B, is the legislature willing to give him that $1 billion worth of additional revenues that he's asking for.
DeWitt said he's concerned about the significant expenditure with regards to the migrant crisis and said the governor is offering migrants carte blanche health care. I'm Katrina Peterson.
Those are the top stories from the past week from Illinois. Find more online at thecentersquare.com. Coming up for Illinois in Focus, I'll join the Center Square's Dan McCaleb to further discuss the news. This is Illinois in Focus, a production of America's Talking Network. I'm Greg Bishop.
Do you know what elected officials in Illinois are doing with your tax dollars? Do you want to make sure that your voice is heard? If so, then you need Blue Room Stream, a live and archived video streaming service that provides access to government meetings and events. With Blue Room Stream, you can watch how your elected officials make decisions, hold them accountable for their actions, and be a more informed citizen. Blue Room Stream is the perfect way to get involved in the democratic process and to make a difference in your community. Subscribe today at blueroomstream.com.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, Chief Content Officer at Franklin News Foundation, publisher of the Center Square Newswire service. We are recording this on Thursday, May 2nd. Controversy erupted in the Illinois House this week after Democrats gutted a bill dealing with child welfare issues and replaced it with a measure that would make sweeping changes to the state's election laws. Republicans walked off the House floor in disgust. Joining me today to discuss this is Greg Bishop, the Center Square's Illinois Associate Editor. Greg, you saw this unfold. Tell us more.
So, Dan, as closely as I cover the State House, we like to think we can somewhat predict when things are going to be happening. But this caught everybody by surprise. The House came to session. They had some points of order. And then you had a Senate bill called, a bill that had already passed the Senate and was now being considered by the House. The bill was about Department of Children and Family Services. But in a committee earlier in the day, they amended it to be the election omnibus bill, changing a variety of things, most of which I think is top of line for people is they're reworking the slating of candidates. We'll explain that a bit, but I think more the process and the procedure of how this measure came about and was passed in the House is important for people to understand. So typically in civics lesson here, when a measure is proposed, it has to be read 3 times in one chamber before it can be passed to the next chamber to win that same bill has to be read 3 times before it can be passed on to the governor. Well, if they have a measure that passes the Senate and goes into the House can essentially gut it and replace it with new language and move it back over to the Senate for concurrence, then onto the governor. Really, in a way, kind of short-circuiting that 3 readings, so to speak. This has been challenged by the courts before, hasn't really gotten any traction, so we'll see if this type of thing happens again. But Dan, it's, the beginning of May. They have until May 31st to adjourn. We typically see these types of things in the last few days of legislative session, not at the beginning of May with still 3 weeks or so left before the end of session. So when they amended this bill, they called it for a vote. The House Republicans immediately called for a caucus, so they went off the floor for about an hour and a half. They came back, then started to debate the bill. Debate didn't last long. And essentially, the bill, as it's amended, no longer about child welfare issues. Now it's about election law. Jay Hoffman, the Democrat sponsor in the House, he laid it out. He said what it does is it brings about 3 non-binding referendum. I believe one of them is on asking voters a non-binding question about in vitro fertilization, another non-binding resolution about protecting election workers, and another non-binding resolution about the state's property taxes. But it would also essentially remove the slating process. For those who don't follow election law closely, we have Illinois, the primary. That was actually back in March of this year. That's where the Republicans put up candidates and Democrats put up candidates to go against the party, and then whoever is the victor there will be the Republican or the Democrat candidate for the November election. If the party doesn't put a candidate in the primary, they can slate a candidate after the primary heading into the November general election. This happens quite a bit. If you recall, going into the primary, we saw more than half of the House seats already determined which party it was going to be, because in a Democrat district, no Republicans ran in the primary. In a Republican district, no Democrats ran in a primary. So essentially what they're doing with this, if it gets back to the Senate, which is expected to pass in the Senate, to be conferred and agreed upon, you're going to see that slating process essentially removed. So Republicans seemingly caught off guard by this switcheroo that happened, this gutting and replacing of a bill that didn't have to do with election, all of a sudden becoming an election bill. Republicans voted present and then promptly walked off the House floor while the House was still in session and held a news conference where they blasted the proposal, saying it is voter disenfranchisement, saying that there's trickery going on, criticizing the proposal. And we'll see ultimately what happens here and how the governor reacts to this. With all of the talk about democracy and securing it as an institution, Republicans pointing to this, saying that this is antithetical to that founding idea.
Greg, and let's be clear, these public readings, they're meant to give the public, you, me, voters across the state, taxpayers who pay their salaries, who pay election officials' salaries, etc., to give them an opportunity to understand what the legislation is about, and if they want to speak up on it, whether it's for it, against it, whatever, to give them that opportunity to do this. When something like this happens in the legislature, that opportunity is pretty much lost, because the bill is introduced, the new language for this bill is introduced on the same day, and it goes up for a vote. How is that democracy?
Well, and the public absolutely needs to be plugged into these things because they can be directly impacted by it. And for being a reporter on the ground and talking with some of my other colleagues from other outlets here, completely caught off guard. Even the Elections and Ethics Committee apparently not even bringing these things up. Instead, the amendment went through the Executive Committee. in the House. So people weren't looking in the Elections Committee for this measure. Instead, it came through the Executive Committee. So again, this is something I think that we typically see at the tail end of session, and typically it's with like the budget, right? They'll take a measure and they'll gut it and replace it. They did this with the state's ban on semi-automatic firearms. That original measure was about insurance. And then all of a sudden they gutted and replaced a bill to make a gun ban in just about 2 days' time. They made that happen in both chambers. So while this is something we see typically at the latter part of session, seeing it this early indicates to Republicans who are critical of it that there is some trickery amidst, and they're trying to block Republicans from slating candidates heading into the November election.
Wow. When relatively new Illinois House Speaker Emanuel Chris Welsh was inaugurated, or was voted the new House Speaker, replacing longtime House Speaker Michael Madigan, he said, and I think I'm quoting him directly, it was a new day in Springfield. This hardly seems like a new day.
Yeah, and again, having been on the ground during the Madigan era, and feeling the pressure campaign at the tail end of session, with sometimes going into 3 o'clock in the morning, if not later. We'll see how that plays out at the tail end of session. But this type of attempt by the Democrats to gut and replace with shell bills and it seeming to catch everyone off guard that wasn't behind closed doors, that doesn't seem like it's a new day. And Republicans obviously very critical, saying that this is just the Democrats working to solidify their supermajorities in both chambers.
All right, let's stick with the legislature this week, Greg. A Democratic lawmaker has introduced proposed legislation that would ban natural gas in new buildings. We've seen some of this legislation in deep blue states, California, Washington State, out on the West Coast, and now there's a bill in Illinois. Tell us about it.
So you've got the idea is that natural gas is not clean energy, and even dangerous. At a recent news conference, you had some individuals speaking. One in particular said that their house was damaged when there was a faulty gas line. So State Senator Selena Villanueva, she has Senate Bill 3935. She calls it the Clean and Healthy Buildings Act. And she said, quote, "We must reduce pollution in our buildings, and we must begin a managed transition away from dirty, expensive gas to more affordable, clean energy solutions," she said. But this has been brought up in like Chicago. They're grappling with this idea. In other jurisdictions across the country, it's been brought up and even challenged in the courts. Dan, I went and looked at the overall energy makeup, what kind of source of energy the state of Illinois uses across the state. Thinking about things like coal, wind, solar, nuclear, natural gas. People might not realize this. It makes up almost a third, if not almost a quarter, of Illinois' energy that's being utilized. So natural gas is a huge player in this state, but some are worried that it's a dirty form of energy, and they want to try to work at curbing, putting new construction into buildings that include natural gas lines. We'll see if this goes anywhere, but just looking at the bill as itself right now, it remains in committee. So this could possibly be, as they call it, a conversation starter. We'll see if this thing moves before the end of spring session.
What do Republicans say about this bill? What does the energy industry think? I assume they're all opposed.
Yeah, I haven't heard much Republican opposition to this, other than people pointing to other states thinking about these types of things, or if the federal government may have had a brush with this type of idea. But the American Gas Association said that natural gas has been one of the primary drivers for achieving environmental progress, and any ban on the foundation fuel will saddle consumers with significant costs for little environmental gain. And you've got others criticizing the potential increased cost from electric energy being for heating, for instance, or some restaurants, for example, if they can't have gas-powered stoves, they feel like their energy costs might go through the roof. So clearly, there's a lot more discussion and debate to be had about this.
Sticking with the topic of energy, particularly fossil fuel energy, Greg, and the concerns over its impact on the environment and on climate. Another bill making its way through the legislature would require every public high school in the state to have a unit of instruction addressing said climate change.
Yeah, this floor debate in the House for a measure brought forward by Janet Yang Rohr, and that would ultimately have the Illinois State Board of Education look to creating a professional development resource for educators to teach climate change coursework. But during debate, I think we get the quote of the week, where State Representative Stephen Reich, and I'll just read this. He said, "So what you're saying is that the legislature is going to add more things on the plate for schools because we've already got so many things on their plates. But you didn't answer my question. What kind of holes exist in the curriculum or in the pedagogy of the climate science that these holes would fill?" He then went on to say, "We can't swing a dead cat without discussing climate this, climate that." So sometimes you get some interesting quotes out of legislators when they're debating these types of bills. But this measure ultimately passed. It would cost $300,000 if it's appropriated, and that's something that we always run into as well at the State House. Is these new programs get brought up, discussed, and passed, but they are, quote, subject to appropriation. And then when the budget comes out and it's not appropriated, and the program doesn't go anywhere. So we'll see if this gets through both chambers. It's already through the House. It could cost $300,000 if it's appropriated in the budget. So we'll watch closely on that one.
Well, I'll give you a prediction, Greg. Seeing that the Democrats have supermajorities in both the House and the Senate, my guess is it passes both chambers. Never know about the appropriation part of it. Of course, we won't probably see the actual bill, the budget bill that gets voted on until the waning days of session, and those will be thousands of pages long. So it'll be some point after session ends when we'll find out if it is in fact appropriated, if the bill itself passes both chambers and is signed by Governor Pritzker. Moving on, more on the Pre-Trial Safety Act. There was a horrendous murder this week. A woman was killed by her husband, who was out on pretrial release and wearing an electronic monitoring device, which police used to make sure he stayed away from his wife. Unfortunately, police weren't able to get to the scene in time, and now Republicans are questioning the legislation that allowed him out pretrial release.
Yeah, there's still a lot of fingers being pointed back and forth on this, especially since the DuPage County State's attorney reportedly did not seek to hold this individual who was arrested for domestic abuse, allegedly beating his wife. And then after he was booked, the Pretrial Fairness Act, there's no more cash bond. So he was let out. And again, because the DuPage County State's attorney did not seek him to be held. But after, as you mentioned, he was on electronic monitoring, was able to get back to his wife before police were able to respond. And it was a murder-suicide, just a tragic story. But you've got two different ideas that seem to be coming in the aftermath of this. One, Republicans, law enforcement community, they say that the Pretrial Fairness Act needs to be changed, that there needs to be more detainable offenses on the list to ensure that things like domestic abuse don't slip through the cracks, and that judges and that prosecutors are more clearly focused on domestic abuse cases to ensure these types of things don't happen. So you've got that side saying, focus on changes to the Pretrial Fairness Act. We need to beef up the detainable offenses. On the other side, you've got people saying that there needs to be a measure passed that allows for, actually requires police to get a search warrant and confiscate firearms from individuals who are the subject of a protective order. So if you get an order of protection against you, a judge can order police to get a search warrant, go into a house, and confiscate your firearms. Dan, I asked Governor J.B. Pritzker about both of these situations, about the Pretrial Fairness Act and about this measure called Karina's Bill that would require police to confiscate firearms. On the Pretrial Fairness Act, the governor said, listen, we need to focus more on domestic abuse cases. Prosecutors and judges need to be more aware of it. So he didn't say that there needed to be any changes to the Pretrial Fairness Act. on the measure requiring police to confiscate guns from domestic abuse victims, or rather domestic abuse protective order subjects. The governor said he likes that idea in concept, but he recognized that even Illinois State Police and local law enforcement have pushed back against this idea because he says the amount of resources necessary to serve a warrant on every type of individual that gets a protective order against them in a domestic abuse case, number one, can take up resources. Number two, it can also put these officers in danger. And we just had a story earlier this week out of North Carolina, I believe, where you had some police officers trying to go to a felon's house and confiscate illegally possessed firearms. And that resulted in the death of some of those officers. So clearly that's an issue that's still being discussed. And just so people know, in the state of Illinois, if you do have a protective order against you, your firearm owner identification card is suspended and you're required to either relinquish those firearms that you may have to somebody else who's eligible to hold them. So that could be somebody across town that you know who has a FOID card, or you can go and voluntarily give those firearms to police. But Karina's bill looks to require police to confiscate these firearms. Tragic story, the reaction to it. Will anything get done on either side of the equation of this? Well, keep us at thecentersquare.com and we'll be tracking all that for you.
And this comes just weeks after the Illinois Prisoner Review Board early released domestic violence offender who also went out and in this case stabbed his girlfriend and their child and killing the child. So certainly some public safety concerns here, Greg. Time for just one last story. It has been a year since the ComEd 4 trial, where 4 consultants, high-ranking officials with ComEd, were convicted of corruption-related charges related to previously mentioned longtime former House Speaker Michael Madigan. Yet they have not been sentenced yet. What's going on with this?
You know, it's fascinating to see the interworkings of how criminal law can be, in a way, slowed down by cases going to the U.S. Supreme Court. So what you have here is you have these individuals facing and being convicted of corruption. A public utility, working with the speaker's office allegedly to get the speaker personal gain for he and his friends in exchange for favorable legislation for the utility. That's what federal prosecutors alleged, and they got convictions in the ComEd 4 trial, and we're awaiting for the trial of former House Speaker Michael Madigan. His case has been delayed, as has the sentencing of these ComEd 4 individuals who have been found guilty because of a case in the U.S. Supreme Court. That was heard this most recent session, and the U.S. Supreme Court looking at the question of what defines bribery. They've dealt with these things before in the past. They've got another question out of a state that's not Illinois. So everybody's anxiously awaiting for some kind of resolution in that case about what constitutes bribery in a political space. And the outcome could be very telling. It could impact the sentencing for the ComEd 4, but it could also very much impact the trial for not just Mike Madigan, but also Mike McLean, who was one of the ComEd 4, and he's a co-defendant in the case with Madigan, scheduled for later this year. Again, these things developing. We'll be watching it closely, but you can read more about all of these at thecentersquare.com.
Greg, thank you for joining us today. As you said, listeners can keep up with all of our stories in the state of Illinois at thecentersquare.com.